Welcome back. Mr. Clarke's back. Time to take a look at 1804, the environmental movement. Some of the things we'll be looking at is the causes and effects of the environmental movement, analyze why environmental protection became a controversial issue, and obviously it's an issue that you can even see playing out in contemporary times as you look at different presidential administrations. Uh, you see the Trump administration pull us out of climate issue protocols and kind of international agreements that kind of work to deal with environmental issues, and then the Biden presidency kind of immediately through executive order brings us back into some of these international climate agreement protocols. So we'll see how this plays out in the years to come, and obviously the environment is something that we need to probably prioritize quite a bit more moving forward in history. So let's look at some of the initial steps that were taken during the 20th century to deal with environmental issues. When you think about the environment, the person who gets, I guess, credit for being the first environmentally conscious president was Theodore Roosevelt. Many people consider him to be one of the best presidents in the history of our country. Although a Republican, he had some of the better traits of both the Republican and Democratic parties, kind of as a blend of his presidency. And as you look at traditionally, Democrats tend to be a little stronger on the environment than Republicans, but there are some exceptions to that rule. So Roosevelt became the first president to set aside land for national parks. Theodore Roosevelt established wildlife preserves and early efforts to deal mostly with land preservation. When you think about some of the major events with question 2 that led up to the environmental movement, in 1952 you had the Great Smog in London that killed over 12,000 people. You had Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, that was published in 1962. You had the Cuyahoga River fire in Ohio in 1969. And in 1970 was another pivot moment in history, some 50 plus years ago. The very first Earth Day and the Environmental Protection Agency established, again, ironically enough, during a Republican presidency under Richard Nixon. Okay, I'm going to read a little excerpt here from Silent Spring, Rachel Carson's book. That's kind of like the handbook or the inspiration to move the environmental movement forward. There once was a town in the heart of America where all life seemed to live in harmony with its surroundings. Then a strange blight crept over the area and everything began to change. Mysterious maladies or illnesses swept across. Flocks of chickens, cattle, sheep all sickened and died. There was a strange stillness. The birds, for example, where had they gone? On the mornings that had once throbbed with the dawn chorus of robins and catbirds and doves and jays and wrens and scores of other bird voices, there was now no sound. Only silence lay over the fields and woods and marsh. No witchcraft, no enemy action had silenced the rebirth of new life in this stricken, distressed world. The people had done it to themselves and created what would be a silent spring. So, it's a pretty effective passage there. Carson's writing style was effective and persuasive. Silent Spring had a huge impact on how people thought about their responsibilities to the environment. It made people aware of how industrialization had impacted nature, and it spurred people to take action. Things that you take for granted today. For example, when I was in high school, back in the 1980s, there wasn't any recycling going on. Nobody even really thought about issues like that. So something that you kind of take for granted really didn't even exist, 35, 40 years ago. Okay, let's read this quote on the Cuyahoga River fire. It says here, the Cuyahoga River oozes rather than flows, and that a person does not drown but decays if they go into the river. What can you conclude about the point of view of the author of the article in Time magazine about the fire? Well, the author is clearly an environmental activist who wants to communicate how awful the pollution was along the Cuyahoga River. So much so that a fire broke out on the river at one point in time because there was so much oil and sludge in the river itself. What conclusions can you draw about public sentiment towards the environment in the 1960s based on laws Nixon passed as president? The public was supportive of protecting the environment. Nixon was initially hesitant, not necessarily an environmental supporter, but overwhelming public opinion kind of drove him to understand, and he kind of adapted as president. And I guess a sign of a strong leader is the willingness to adapt and change. He helped to pass several important environmental regulations, including some of the more significant acts in the history of our country for the environment. These acts included, and they're pretty self-explanatory, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, and created the Environmental Protection Agency. So if you're looking for a core four, those are certainly four significant actions taken by the Nixon administration. When was the first Earth Day held? April 22nd, 1970. On the Earth Day celebration, students emphasized the preservation of the environment. Historians believe this was the start of the environmental movement. What are some organizations, with number 7 here, that work towards protecting the environment? The Sierra Club, the Audubon Society, the WWF, the World Wildlife Fund, and the Wilderness Society. 8, how does the Environmental Protection Agency impact society? Well, Nixon established this in 1970. These are the broad goals or tasks of the EPA. They are to set and enforce pollution standards, both on automobiles and factories, promote research, coordinate anti-pollution activities with state and local governments. Today, that position is a cabinet level position, one of which has great authority to kind of impact standards across the country. 9, how did the Clean Air Act impact the environment? It led to a 60% reduction in ozone pollution since 1970, a drastic reduction in air pollutant related deaths, heart attacks, and breathing issues. 10, how did the Clean Water Act impact the environment? Many more Americans' water supply comes from treatment plants, so the water is now more purified. 11, how did the Endangered Species Act impact animals? More than 1,400 species have been protected since the passage of this act in the 1970s. All right, so this visual here could give you some additional insight into some of the things we're discussing. Since the Clean Air Act, 60% overall reduction in fine particle and ozone pollution, 160,000 premature deaths prevented due to the Clean Air Act, 130,000 heart attacks prevented, 54,000 cases of chronic bronchitis prevented, a significant impact over the past 50 plus years. Since the Clean Water Act, 66% of the lakes in the United States are still polluted for swimming and fishing. Americans whose water supply is supported by water treatment plants, 1972, 85 million. By 2008, that had gone up to 226 million. The Endangered Species Act, 1,400 plant animal species managed, and this is the number protected by different administrations. Nixon, Ford in the early to mid 70s, 47. Carter's presidency, 126. Reagan's presidency, 254. George Herbert Walker Bush, 232. Bill Clinton, 522, the champion there. And then George W. Bush, 62, and President Obama, 59 during his presidency. Explain what happened in the housing development in Love Canal. This is near Niagara Falls in New York State during the 1970s. During the 1970s, people who were living in that region began to notice an increasingly high incidence of health problems amongst community members. This included, but not limited to, nerve damage, blood-borne diseases, cancer, miscarriages, and birth defects. So they began to do an investigation. As we look at 13, residents discovered that the housing development was built upon a decades-old toxic waste dump. Over time, the hazardous contents, which were in metal drums, the drums rusted away, and then, of course, the hazardous materials leaked into the soil, got into the water supply, and obviously they were being poisoned within their community for a long period of time. The imagery here, these are basically the drums eventually dug up out of the ground. You can see how damaged many of them were and kind of rusted color. A school was built on top of the dump as well, so the water and the everything there was kind of just seeping into that community. Obviously, they closed that school down. Of course, nobody wants to admit to fault in a situation like this. They fought hard for most of the 70s until finally, after a mass media campaign brought the problems to the attention of the entire nation, the federal government finally agreed to fund the relocation of 200 families, and President Jimmy Carter in the 1970s declared it a national disaster. So we look at a situation like that. So once the rumor spreads that there's chemical waste or hazardous waste in the soil in a town or a community, your home now becomes valueless. You can't sell your home. So you could say, why didn't these families move out sooner? Well, if your entire life savings, work, and investment is in a particular home, you would not necessarily have the money to walk away from that home and start over. 15, how did President Carter impact Love Canal in 1980? Federal aid workers sealed the waste within an underground bunker, burned the homes in the community to the ground, and cleaned up the site. So just probably the biggest disaster in American history in terms of a single community. You can see the imagery here, hazardous chemicals. This little boy here, please help me. Love Canal recipe, mix 82 chemicals, place in canal for 25 years. What it will yield? Sickness and death. '16, what are fossil fuels? Obviously, I would hope you know this by now. Why should we be concerned about them? There's a limited supply of fossil fuels because they are naturally made. At some point in time, humanity may run out of them, and they're naturally occurring natural resources such as coal and oil, natural gas, all of which are essential to the inner workings of society, both here in the United States and around the world. And some of those resources obviously are pollutants as well, so you have to be somewhat cautious in how you use those particular resources. 17, why was the use of nuclear power encouraged during the 1970s? Advocates argued that nuclear power was cleaner and less expensive to their alternatives like fossil fuels. And it was going along reasonably well in the United States for a long period of time. Then, in 1979, at 3 Mile Island in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, the worst nuclear disaster in American history occurred. The disaster was almost a complete meltdown. They evacuated the entire area, fearing the worst. Fortunately, some good decisions made at the plant saved it from a complete meltdown. But some of the waste did leak into the ground and into the water supply there. And it also led to many Americans looking down on the use of nuclear energy. A lot of people were fearful. And because of the fear factor that came out of 3 Mile Island, people were afraid of the unknown. Nobody wanted a nuclear power plant in their neighborhood. Since 1979, over 60 nuclear power plants have been shut down, and very few facilities have been built since 1973. I think there's been one or two since. But they actually closed one down in New Jersey recently, too. Oyster Creek in southern New Jersey in Ocean County, near Lacey Township. Okay, 20, what are some arguments against environmental regulations? Some people did not believe the government needed to make environmental regulations, that people would do it on their own because it was in their interest. They didn't feel like they had to micromanage citizens. Others believed that laws protecting the environment infringed upon individual property rights owners as well as business owners. 21, explain some of the basic assumptions about the environment and human nature that the opponents of the environmental regulation believed. Opponents believed that the environmental situation was not as dire as others believed. They also thought that people would protect the environment without needing laws. Finally, the lesson reflection. How has the United States and the world progressed in regard to the environmental safety issues since the 1970s? What environmental issues are of greatest concern? They mandated recycling, they reduced emission standards, more fuel-efficient cars. And of course, the collective planet, 8+ billion people need to come together on a more comprehensive plan Maybe not necessarily to protect my future, but maybe my children's future and your future as well, as these issues are going to manifest themselves sometime this century. Maybe not in my lifetime, but certainly within yours. Hopefully you enjoyed our environmental discussion, and until next time, Mr. Clarke is out.